In early January, only weeks before Donald Trump assumed the American presidency, he held a press conference at his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, during which he explicitly laid out his goals towards American territorial expansion during his second term in office. Trump claimed during this press conference without evidence that the Panama Canal was being operated by China, that it was a mistake to have ever given the canal to Panama in the first place, and that America needed the canal for economic security. Then he also said that the United States also needed the island of Greenland for national security purposes, questioned Denmark's legal right to the territory, urged Denmark to give it up, and threatened to impose crushing high-level tariffs on Denmark if they refused to cooperate. And then, when responding to a question asked by a reporter at the conference, Trump very pointedly refused to rule out using the US military to acquire either the Panama Canal from Panama or Greenland from Denmark through force if they refused to negotiate. And since then, these comments have sent shockwaves around the world, as everyone has attempted to answer just how serious Trump's comments were or weren't. The president of Panama has since insisted that every last square meter of the Panama Canal is Panamanian, and that control over it by anyone else is completely non-negotiable. While similarly, the prime ministers of both Denmark and Greenland have insisted that Greenland is not for sale to America. And in a more subtle refute of Trump's comments at Mar-a-Lago, the recently crowned Danish King Frederick X ordered a new update to the country's royal coat of arms that more heavily emphasizes the position of the polar bear in the lower left, which represents Greenland's status within the Danish kingdom. So far, the battle being fought over who should control Greenland between Denmark, America, or Greenland itself has been fully contained to chat rooms across the internet. But in order to understand the context behind Trump's comments toward Greenland, and what could actually end up happening regarding the territory, it helps to start with some history and what makes Greenland so inherently valuable to the interests of the United States, regardless of who's actually in power. By this point, Trump himself has a long history of suggesting that America should acquire the world's largest island from Denmark, a territory that's roughly the same size as the whole of Western Europe. He first suggested that America should make an offer to purchase Greenland during his first term in office in 2019, which was politely but firmly rejected by the Danish government at the time, and only caused a light amount of tension between the two heavily allied governments. But America's interest in acquiring Greenland from Denmark goes back way further into the past than most Americans probably realize. Long before Donald Trump, while Denmark's roots in Greenland go even further back before the United States even existed as a country. The ancestors of today's Danes, the Vikings, discovered Greenland as an uninhabited island a very long time ago, sometime around the year 1000, and began settling it. But they eventually died out and abandoned Greenland around 450 years later, sometime around 1450. The ancestors of today's Inuit people in Greenland began arriving to the island around the same time as the Vikings were abandoning it. And then, 3 centuries later in 1721, Denmark began resettling Greenland again and incorporated the island as a colony of theirs. Greenland then continually remained as a colonial possession of Denmark for centuries, except for a brief period during World War II between 1941 and 1945, when Denmark itself in Europe was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the United States took it upon itself to militarily occupy Greenland to keep it out of Germany's hands. After the war ended, the United States turned Greenland's control back over to Denmark again, and Denmark further incorporated Greenland into their country by making the entire island a county of Denmark itself. By this point, the vast majority of Greenland's population were ethnically Inuit, and at the tail end of the decolonization era in 1979, Denmark finally granted Greenland its home rule and broad autonomy. Greenland gained its own separate parliament and full control over its own domestic affairs, including setting policy concerning any mining on the island, while Denmark still retained full control over Greenland's foreign and security policies without the need to consult the Greenlanders much themselves. Much later on in 2009, after voters approved a referendum in Greenland, the island and Denmark agreed on a new self-government act that provided a legal pathway for Greenland to eventually declare its independence from Denmark if they ever desired to do so. From then on through to the present day, but the Danish foreign minister at the time rejected the offer, saying that while his country owed the Americans a great deal for their assistance during the Second World War, he felt that they didn't owe them the entire island of Greenland. But while Denmark didn't agree to sell Greenland to the Americans, they still recognized how important the territory was to them and essentially allowed the Americans to use Greenland for everything they actually wanted. Denmark and the US both became founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949, and in 1951, the two countries agreed on a treaty that allowed the US to build a massive new Air Force base in the far northwest of the island that became known as Thule Air Base. Thule then became one of America's most important overseas military bases during the Cold War. It enabled U.S. reconnaissance aircraft a base to spy on the northern Soviet Union from. It also became a base from which American nuclear-armed strategic bombers could use to threaten the Soviet Union from. And early warning radar systems set up there enabled America to detect any potential nuclear-armed ICBMs that the Soviets fired over the Arctic Circle towards the U.S. mainland. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US government has repeatedly demanded that Denmark improve their aerial surveillance capabilities over Greenland. And a study in 2022 by the US-based RAND Corporation suggested then that integrating Greenland into the coverage of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, would help to mitigate this. The old American Air Base at Thule has since been transformed into a US Space Force base that's now known as Patuxent Space Base. And it's also only grown in importance to the US military's strategic planning. The US military now operates several polar orbiting communications, weather and imaging satellites that cover the northern hemisphere. And these satellites require a station that's down on the ground within the Arctic Circle for their consistent tracking, telemetry, and control. And today, the only two polar satellite operations facilities that the United States controls are Patuxent in Greenland and Clear in central Alaska. Thus, if the US lost control over Patuxent for whatever reason today, like, say, in the event of Greenland becoming independent from Denmark and then just telling the US to leave, America would be forced to rely exclusively on their base in Alaska for their continued polar satellite operations. And whoever ends up controlling Greenland will have the best geographic positioning possible to extend their own control and influence over this new trade route that will probably become even more valuable than the Suez Canal in the not-too-distant future. And beyond the future valuable trade routes running by Greenland that everyone's interested in, there's also the well-known treasure trove of Greenland's incredibly valuable mineral resources that everyone wants some kind of access to as well. The U.S. Geological Survey maintains a list of 50 mineral commodities that are critical to the U.S. economy and national security. At the present, roughly half of these critical minerals have their production dominated by China, including very key minerals that are important for modern technologies like gallium and germanium used in semiconductors. But as the world has grown increasingly interested in the sheer scale of the wealth of Greenland's resources, the pace of mining there has steadily increased. Only a decade ago in the mid-2010s, there were just 12 exploratory sites across the island where firms were drilling for resources at. Today, there's around 170 exploration sites where drilling is currently taking place. But there's also only one single active mine on the entire island for the moment. And that's where Greenland's current problems begin. Because Greenland has such a small population and virtually no industries to speak of, the availability of capital in the island is naturally going to be extremely small until they can actually get large-scale mining going off the ground. But in order to do that, they need a huge amount of capital to get the required infrastructure into place that they don't have and will never have on their own. And the overall investigation is set to conclude at some point this year in 2025. This whole investigation within the small community of just 56,000 people in Greenland has almost certainly contributed to a greater shift in the island's desire for independence from Denmark, led by a prime minister who is already very pro-independence. At a press conference on the 10th of January after Trump's comments, Greenland's prime minister plainly stated, quote, "We don't want to be Danes, we don't want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlanders," end quote. Greenland's next elections are coming up soon, and with the ongoing investigation into the colonial-era birth control scandal, the topic of independence from Denmark was already going to be the front and center issue. And now, Trump's comments about purchasing or acquiring Greenland have effectively thrown gasoline onto the pro-independence flames that were already burning there, whether Trump intended to do that or not. There are many people in Greenland who now see the value in playing Denmark and the United States off of one another.